Welcome back, everybody. This is the next video in our EGG202 video series tutorial. In this video, we're going to go over maintaining several buttons and sort of having one event for all buttons. Instead of having each button having its own event, we're going to have several buttons that will sort of link to one event. And also, we're going to have an array that will store all the buttons in some C# array, just to be able to also manipulate the buttons as well. So the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and just create some buttons onto our form as always. So I'll go ahead and I'll just add maybe 4 buttons, I guess should be enough. So we go ahead and sort of go ahead and Control-C to copy and paste it a few times, just so we have a few buttons we can work with over here. Like that. And of course, I want to give these buttons a good name because I'm going to be using these button names in my program code. So I'm going to go ahead and call this one maybe just BTN1. Not the best name, but it's a pretty simple way to ID this button in my code. So BTN1 is a pretty good name actually to use for that. Then BTN2, then BTN3, and then BTN4. And then I'll go ahead and add another button over here. I'll add maybe a clear button. So I'm going to have it where if I click on a button, it's going to update the button's text. So I'm going to have maybe a counter for each button like that. But I'm going to just, for right now, go ahead and sort of create this button over here. So I'm going to have a button called BTN clear, and text I'm going to give to it is going to be also clear. Now for the buttons I have up top, I'm going to be very careful to not double click on these because I don't want the event to be created automatically. I'm going to create my own event and have each button will automatically call the same event, just because it might be a bit more cleaner, instead of having several events, each one for its own button, just have all 4 buttons call the same event and just ID which button was the one that was called, basically. So let's go ahead and double click on my form to create the form load sort of function. Now over here in the form load, I want to go ahead and sort of clear out every button to contain sort of a 0 for its text. Now of course I could do it the regular way, to say btn1 dot text equals 0. Like that, and it would set that button's text to be 0. So let's go ahead and sort of start this and see what it does. So the rest contain these default text, but the first button contains 0. So I could do it for all 4 like that, but I'm going to just use a loop for right now to just basically so I want to store these 4 buttons into a button array, a C# type of an array. So I'm going to, first set up my array in my program. So I'm going to close this. I'm going to do the following. I'm going to wipe this out. At the very top, I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call this variable, it will be an array of type button. Now I'm going to call it buttons for right now, equals new button 4. Oops. So just like with kind of like doing C++ dynamic arrays, this allocates an array of 4 buttons to this button's identifier. So this buttons is going to be an array of 4 buttons. So now I want to go ahead and load each of these into my program. So I'm going to the following loop. I have a loop that runs 4 times. So I'm going to say for int I equals 0. I less than buttons dot length I plus plus. I'm going to set buttons 0 to equal some. I'm going to have it sort of point to an element on my in my form. So I'm going to do the following. This dot controls. I'm going to retrieve a button, so I'm going to say for right now btn plus I plus 1 dot toString. So we're going to refer to this button. We're going to sort of, so this dot controls in that bracket is going to try to find sort of this button with that name. So every button has btn1 and btn2, btn3, and btn4. So I contains 0, 1, 2, and 3. So I plus 1. So initially when I is 0, it will be I plus 1 is 1. Dot toString converts that 1 sort of digit into a string 1. And then it's going to basically then convert that to a string and concatenate that to btn. So it's going to retrieve btn1, then btn2, then btn3, btn4, and btn5. So it's good that we use sort of an easy name to ID every button. And of course, we have to typecast this into a button object like that. So it's simply, oops, I'm supposed to use I over here, not 0, my mistake. So it's going to retrieve every button from our form. So now our button array will be able to refer to each button on our form using this buttons array. So this can be a little bit more niftier to do this, but anyway, let's go ahead now and clear all the buttons in the following way. So I'm going to use a for each loop over here. So for each button btn in buttons, btn.text equals 0. Now, of course, I could use an old-fashioned way of doing a C++ style loop. I could have said for I equals 0, I less. I guess I can also put this right here as well, just to kind of put it below. I could also do the following. I could say for int I equals 0, I less than buttons dot length I plus plus buttons I dot text equals 0. So these two loops are exactly the same, but since we're iterating through a list like this, I guess a for each loop does look a bit nicer. It's sort of, I don't know, makes more sense to do like this, but either one would work just the same. I'll comment this one out just because there's no point to really run this part of our code, but just for reference, I'll put that there. So when the program runs, it's going to basically set all the elements. So every button in our form that has, btn and then btn1, btn2, 3, and 4 will be assigned to buttons 0, 1, 2, and 3. And then I can use this buttons array to manipulate objects on our form. So let's go ahead and run the start. And we can see here, all the buttons are 0 because this buttons array, so when I say buttons 0 dot text equals 0, it'll set this button to 0. Then when I have buttons 1 dot text, it's going to set this text to 0, and so forth. So far we were able to successfully set up our button array and be able to manipulate buttons through this array. So now I'm going to go ahead and create an event which will have it where every single button is going to basically call the same sort of event function. Alright, so now we're going to create a function and have each of these buttons sort of triggered at one function. So once again, be careful to not double click on any of these buttons, or else it kind of messes up the entire, it ruins the entire, well, defeats the whole purpose of this video. So I'm going to very carefully right click, view code, and I'm going to just add an event function. So I'm going to try to make sure I put it right here. Yep, that's a good spot. I'm going to create a function called private void. I'll just call it button clicked, just to call it that pretty generic name. And we're going to have our object sender, and then event arg, which is sort of the that's the syntax or the setup to create this function. So we have this function defined. So now I have to find a way to make it so each button will automatically get linked to this function. So I'm going to go back to my editor, or to my view. Oh, it's still actually running. Okay, I'm going to stop this. So I'm going to click on my button 1, and the right side over here where we have our controls or properties, I'm going to click on this sort of thunderbolt, which is, I guess, events. Click on events, And we have several set of events. I mean, there's a lot of events we actually have. We have a hover over, all kinds of stuff. But let's go into the click event. And I wanted to actually basically call a function. So I have this button 1 clicked that I defined earlier. I'm going to select that one. So now this button 1 is going to call that button clicked function. So let's go ahead and now go to my second button. I'll click on a second button. Don't double click, just single click on it. And then go to the right side here. I'm going to select button clicked. And same thing for button 3. Unclick, set button clicked. And button 4, unclick, select button clicked, which is that function I wrote. So each button is going to call the same function. Let's go ahead and just test this out and see what it actually does. So we're going to first do the following. We're going to write some code here. So I'm going to, for right now, I'm just going to have maybe a message box, just so it outputs something to us so we can see what's going on. I think message box dot show. So I just want to display what button was clicked. So we're going to say button. We're going to take the sender object and we're going to typecast it to a button. And we're going to access the text field of it. So we're going to simply display the actual text of the button that was clicked. So what we're going to do is a sender object is going to tell us, well, which object was the one that triggered this function. We typecast it to a button object and access the text field of it. Let's go ahead and run this. I'm going to go over here, click on this button. Outputs 0. So actually it outputs the text associated with it. So you know what? I'm going to go ahead and actually, whoops, I'm going to modify this a little bit. I'm going to say not text, but .name instead. So outputs it gave us a text because the text of that button is in fact going to be 0. So let's go ahead and output the name instead. I click over here, outputs btn1. Click over here, btn2, btn3, and btn4. So basically every time you click on these 4 buttons, it's going to call this function button clicked. So pretty cool. So far we have that set up. So I'm going to have it where I'm going to have possibly have a counter where I click on a button, updates its text, and then we can go ahead and clear it out just like that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close this. And then now what I'll do is I'm going to actually update that button's sort of field. So it has a 0. I'm going to always add 1 to the button's current text. So of course I can do it through this button's array, but I'll make it simple on myself and just do it through the sender object. But at the end, when I click on the clear button, I'll traverse through the array and clear all the buttons out to be 0. I also might create a label actually, so I can add up the weights or add up the button sort of values. So let me go ahead and do that actually right over here. So I'm going to create a label to simply just output the sum. Actually, I'm going to take sort of the first button, multiply it by 1, plus the value in button 2 multiplied by 2, plus the value in button 3 multiplied by 3, and so forth, just to get a more interesting sort of sum over here. So I'm going to go back to my properties. I'm going to click on label and go to my properties and click on, I think, let me see, how do you go back to the way it was originally? There it is. So click on that properties option. I'm going to select LBL output just for right now. The text will be labeled 1, but of course I can easily just set that text to be blank through my form load. Just LBL output dot text equals blank, so no problems there. Okay, so now in our button clicked event, we know how to access the name of the button. So I'm going to now wipe this part out. I'm going to now have a variable type int. And int, I'm going to maybe just have this be value, I'll call it. I'm going to extract, so the text on that button is going to be a number, but it'll be a string. So I'm going to take that text from the button, I'm going to convert it into integer and store it into value so I can add 1 to it and put it back to the original button's text field. So I'm going to say for right now again, sender. Sender dot, actually I'm going to go ahead and typecast it into a button. I believe, let me just double check this. Oh, send me button. Oops, my mistake. So I'm going to go ahead and say button sender. So I'm going to typecast the sender object into a button. Dot text. I'm going to go ahead and use the int dot parse on all of that and store this into my value variable. And of course, you got to put a semicolon at the end. So this retrieves that text, and it's going to store it as an integer to my value parameter, or not parameter, variable. Then I'll just say value plus plus, incremented by 1. And I'm going to go ahead and store this number into the into my button. So I'm going to say again, button sender dot text equals value dot toString. So of course I could have been able to do this through the array actually, because all these buttons in this array are able to directly access every element on the form, every button on the form. But I'll do it like this because I don't want to overcomplicate this too much. So now what I'll do is after a button is clicked, I'm going to go ahead and run a loop to sum up. Well, I'm actually going to first just make sure it actually works first. Then we'll go ahead and I'll write a loop that will sum up all the elements, all the buttons, and I'll put it to a label. Let's go ahead and click on start. So it does seem to be working. It's definitely updating the buttons counter just like that. So that's nifty. All right, cool. So it's definitely working. So now I want to go ahead and have a way of being able to sum up all these buttons. Actually, maybe I can create another button actually just for a sum. So we'll add up all the buttons on this, add these buttons up, these values up, and output it to the label. Let's go ahead and do that next. So I'm going to go ahead and just go to my toolbar. And why is my toolbar all empty? Why is it empty over here? Let me just go back to my form. There it is. Okay, that was interesting. But anyway, I'm going to add another button over here. Oops. I'll try to make it about the same size as this clear button. So let me see. It's perfect. And I'll call this button just sum. And then the button name will be just btn sum. So for this one, I can go ahead and then double click on this because really I'm only going to have one event. It's kind of earmarked to work only for the sum button. So I can go ahead and double click on this to create the event. So it creates a btn sum click. And actually, I want to show you one thing first. Actually, let me go back to my form, click on the sum button. If I go and click on events, it shows right there, btn sum underscore click. That's the function that's going to be triggered when I click on this button. So it's not really all magic actually, but up to this point, it might have been like magic, but I double clicked on it, created a function, automatically added it to that event, which is kind of nifty. So anyway, the sum function is going to basically, I'm going to take my a variable called int sum equals 0. I'm going to go ahead and say for each button btn in buttons, I'm going to have sum plus equal btn dot text, and of course I want to convert that to an integer, so int dot parse. So simply just extracts the text field of that button, converts it into an int, and then adds it up into our sum. So we could of course do this, we can sort of add up each button manually, but having this array is a lot more nicer. If we had a lot of buttons potentially, we can cycle through all the buttons very nicely using a loop. So this is a very simple sort of array traversal for 135, but of course if you're new to arrays, basically all I'm doing is going through every single button on this form. But of course, I actually could do this in this type of fashion as well. I could actually go ahead and just say sum equals sum plus button 0, and then you go ahead and do buttons, button 0 dot text. So I could do it without using a loop. Of course, I could have just used I could have created sort of 4 button variables instead of having an array of buttons. So I could have actually up top over here just create 4 button objects instead. I could have just said button btn1 and then button btn2, and then have button 1 equal to button button this dot controls. So I could have actually not used the loop, but I guess for most of us though who've done 1.3.5, then arrays are kind of natural. But if you haven't done arrays before, you could create just 4 button objects instead of having an array of buttons, but this is a lot more niftier than that. So anyway, now I'm going to go ahead and just sort of go lbl output dot text equals sum of buttons equals, I'm actually going to do something different. Actually, I made a mistake here, so I'll just say sum.toString. I actually wanted to multiply sort of this amount by some value actually. So I'm going to maybe go ahead and actually go back to my regular array version. So remember, I wanted to sort of go ahead and say, take the value in this button, multiply it by 1, plus the value in this button, multiply it by 2. I wanted to do that kind of formula instead, so I have to modify my code a little bit actually. So I'll go back to the regular old-fashioned way. Int I equals 0, I less than buttons.length, I plus plus, and sum plus equal I plus 1 multiplied by buttons index 0 dot text, and then convert this into an integer and dot parse like that. This is actually going to now simulate that. So it's going to take the first button multiplied by 1, add it to the second button's value multiplied by 2, and so forth, and sum them all up just like that. Also, I'm going to go ahead and right now write the clear function. So I'm going to double click on this button just to create that event automatically. So it's kind of simpler than writing it manually and going to the actual events sort of tab. Is a simpler way, but let's go ahead and sort of write this code. I'm going to just use the I'll use the for each loop, I guess, this time, since it is kind of nicer to use that. Button btn in buttons btn dot text equals 0. So I'm going to go through all the buttons and cycle through them all and assign text of 0 to each one of them. Then also I'm going to clear out the output, so lbl output dot text, I also clear it out to be empty as well. So this is going to be the final product. Let's go ahead and test this out, and this will be the end of the video. Let's go ahead and just run this and see if it does work. So of course it is updating nicely. If I hit sum, then it runs that formula. So it takes 1 times 2 plus 2 times 4 plus 3 times 3 plus 4 times 2. Now it should be 27. If I hit clear, it sets all these to 0 just like that. So this is just an example of having it where we have multiple buttons that can call the same event function, and we can have an array in C# which can link to each button on our form and cycle through buttons instead of having to manually one by one create a different variable, and one by one having to create different events. We can have it where one event handles all buttons, and the array of buttons that can cycle through all of them and parse them and add them up and clear them up and whatever you want to do with them. So that was the end of this tutorial. So the tutorial is now over. So I guess my computer had some weird issue right there for some reason. So anyway, that's the end of the tutorial. Hopefully you found it useful. So I guess take care, and until next time.